The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast table where 8-year-old Ethan Mitchell sat, methodically eating his cereal while his father, Officer David Mitchell, adjusted his duty belt one final time. The familiar ritual of morning preparations had become second nature. The soft clink of handcuffs, the rustle of his father's uniform, the gentle kiss on Ethan's forehead that always tasted faintly of aftershave and coffee. "Be good for Mom today, buddy," David said, his voice carrying that warm authority that made Ethan feel safe in any storm. "I'll see you tonight for our chess match. I've been practicing my night moves." Ethan looked up from his bowl, milk dripping from his spoon. "You always say that, Dad, but I still beat you every time." His grin revealed the gap where his front tooth had been, a badge of honor from last week's playground adventure. David chuckled, ruffling his son's sandy hair. "One of these days, kiddo, one of these days." He gathered his keys and radio, pausing at the doorway to wave goodbye. Ethan waved back, already turning his attention to the cartoon playing on the small kitchen television. That afternoon, Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, chess pieces scattered around him as he practiced the new strategy he'd read about in his library book. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the hours until his father's return. His mother, Sarah, moved quietly through the house, folding laundry and humming softly, a sound that usually meant all was right in their small world. The knock came at 4:17 p.m. Ethan would remember that time forever, frozen like a photograph in his memory. It wasn't his father's familiar 3-tap rhythm, but something heavier, more hesitant. Through the window, he glimpsed the black and white patrol cars lined up along their quiet street like sleeping giants. Sarah opened the door to reveal Captain Rodriguez and Chaplain Williams, their faces etched with the kind of gravity that transforms ordinary moments into life-altering ones. Ethan couldn't hear their words from where he sat, but he watched his mother's face crumble like paper in rain, watched her hand fly to her mouth as if trying to catch the pieces of their world as they fell. "Ethan, come here, sweetheart." His mother called, her voice breaking like glass. He approached slowly, chess piece still clutched in his small fist. A white knight, frozen mid-move in a game that would never be finished. The words came in fragments that his 8-year-old mind struggled to assemble. Line of duty, accident, everything possible. So sorry, but it was the silence that followed that truly shattered him. The absence of his father's key in the lock, the missing sound of boots on the hardwood floor, the emptiness where laughter should have been. Captain Rodriguez knelt to Ethan's eye, level, his own eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "Your daddy was a hero, son. He saved 3 people today. He saved them, and he can't come home to us." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Ethan stared at the chess piece in his palm, its carved edges pressing into his skin. Heroes, he thought, were supposed to come home. Heroes were supposed to keep their promises about chess matches and bedtime stories. Heroes weren't supposed to leave their sons sitting on living room floors, clutching game pieces like talismans against a suddenly hostile world. As evening fell and the house filled with neighbors bearing casseroles and condolences, Ethan remained on the carpet surrounded by his abandoned chess game. Each piece stood silent sentinel to a match that would remain forever unfinished, knights and kings frozen in eternal battle, while somewhere beyond his understanding, his father had made his final, most courageous move. The first morning without his father arrived gray and reluctant, seeping through Ethan's bedroom curtains like an unwelcome visitor. He lay motionless beneath his superhero comforter, listening to the sounds of a house learning to function with a piece of its heart missing. His mother's muffled sobs echoed from the kitchen, punctuated by the gentle voices of relatives who had descended like protective wings around their fractured family. School felt impossible. The very thought of sitting at his desk, pretending to care about math problems and spelling tests, seemed like a betrayal of the grief that sat heavy in his chest. But Aunt Carol, his father's sister with the same kind eyes and stubborn chin, sat on his bed and spoke softly about routines and healing, about how his father would want him to be brave. "I don't know how to be brave without him," Ethan whispered, the admission scraping his throat raw. At 7:45 a.m., the rumble of engines outside drew him to the window. 3 patrol cars sat in his driveway, their occupants stepping out with ceremonial precision. Officer Martinez, who had been his father's partner and fishing buddy, stood at their front door holding a small American flag. Behind him, Sergeant Thompson and Officer Chen waited with respectful solemnity, their badges catching the weak morning light. "We're here to take you to school, son," Officer Martinez said when Ethan appeared beside his mother. "Your dad asked us to look after you, and that's exactly what we're going to do." The ride to school passed in a blur of radio chatter and gentle conversation. Officer Martinez told stories about Ethan's father, how he always kept extra granola bars in his patrol car for hungry kids, how he knew every dog's name in their district, how he could make anyone laugh even on the worst days. Ethan pressed his face against the window, watching familiar streets scroll past from this new vantage point behind protective steel and glass. At school, the arrival of the police escort created a ripple of whispers and stares. Principal Davies waited at the main entrance, her usually stern expression softened with compassion. Ethan's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, knelt to his level as Officer Martinez walked him to the classroom door. "We'll be here every morning," Officer Martinez promised, adjusting his radio. "Rain or shine, we'll make sure you get to school safe. Your dad would never forgive us if we let you down." The classroom felt alien and overwhelming. 23. Pairs of eyes tracked his movement to his desk, where a small pile of cards and drawings waited. "We're sorry about your dad," whispered Lucy from the next seat, sliding him a crayon drawing of a police car with wings. "My mom says he's watching over you now." During recess, while other children played kickball and climbed monkey bars, Ethan sat alone on a bench, watching the parking lot where the patrol car waited like a faithful guardian. Officer Chen approached, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, settling beside him before he could answer. "Your father talked about you all the time, you know. He was so proud of how smart you are, how kind you are to others." "I miss him," Ethan said simply, the words carrying the weight of oceans. "I miss him too," Officer Chen replied. "But you know what? Every time I see you being brave, going to school, taking care of your mom, I see him. The best parts of him live on in you." As the days stretched into weeks, the morning escort became routine. Different officers took turns, each bringing their own stories and gentle wisdom. They spoke of duty and sacrifice, of community and family that extended beyond blood. They showed him that while his father was gone, he wasn't abandoned, that the thin blue line had expanded to encircle him with protection and love. Slowly, school became bearable again. His grades remained steady, his friendships deepened, and the sharp edges of grief began to wear smooth under the constant pressure of daily life. But every morning as he climbed into that patrol car, Ethan carried with him the knowledge that heroes came in many forms, and sometimes they kept their promises in ways you never expected. 3 months after the funeral, Ethan discovered that grief wasn't a straight line but a winding path, full of unexpected turns and hidden obstacles. Some days felt almost normal. He could laugh at his friend Jake's jokes during lunch, concentrate on his homework, even forget for entire minutes why his chest felt hollow. Other days, the simplest things, the scent of his father's cologne lingering on an unwashed shirt, the sound of sirens in the distance, would send him spiraling into tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sadness. Dr. Sarah Hendricks had gentle hands and a voice like warm honey when she spoke. The grief counselor's office felt safe, filled with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that didn't judge when Ethan curled up in them like a wounded animal. Her walls displayed children's artwork, colorful representations of feelings that couldn't be captured in words alone. "Grief isn't something you get over," Dr. Hendricks explained during one of their sessions, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. "It's something you learn to carry, like a backpack that gets lighter as you grow stronger but never completely disappears." Ethan considered this, absently playing with a stress ball shaped like a police badge, a gift from Officer Martinez. "Mom cries when she thinks I can't hear her," he said quietly. "I pretend I don't know, but I do. Sometimes I cry too, but I try to be quiet so she won't worry about me." What do you think your father would say about you and your mom taking care of each other's feelings? The question hung in the air like a butterfly, delicate and requiring careful consideration. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to summon his father's voice from the growing distance of memory. He'd probably say we're both pretty stubborn and that we should just cry together if we need to. That evening, Ethan found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, photo albums spread before her like prayer books, open to favorite verses. She looked up as he approached, quickly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture he'd seen countless times but never acknowledged. "I know you miss him too, Mom," Ethan said simply, climbing into the chair beside her. "Dr. Hendricks says it's okay to be sad together." Sarah's composure crumbled, and she pulled her son against her chest, both of them crying openly for the first time since the funeral. They looked through photos together, sharing memories and stories, transforming grief from a solitary burden into something they could bear together. At school, Ethan began participating in the peer support group Mrs. Patterson had started. Other children dealing with loss, divorce, grandparents' deaths, military deployments gathered twice a week to share their experiences. He discovered that pain, while unique in its details, shared common threads of love and longing. Tommy's Tati, parents were divorced and he only saw his father on weekends. Maria's grandmother, who had raised her, was battling cancer. Each story reminded Ethan that he wasn't alone in carrying heavy things, that other children had learned to balance normal life with extraordinary sadness. "My dad used to read me stories every night," Ethan shared during one session. "Now I read them to myself, but I use his voice in my head. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it just makes me miss him more." The group's gentle nods and understanding murmurs created a circle of acceptance that felt like a warm blanket on cold nights. They shared coping strategies, breathing exercises, memory journals, ways to honor their loved ones, turning their individual struggles into collective wisdom. Physical activity became another pathway to healing. Officer Martinez had suggested martial arts, explaining that Ethan's father had practiced karate as a child. The discipline of forms and movements provided structure for emotions too big for words, while the philosophy of respect and inner strength echoed lessons his father had taught him. Sensei Williams, a retired police officer himself, understood the unique challenges facing police families. During training, he spoke of channeling anger and sadness into purpose, of finding strength in vulnerability, of honoring those who came before by becoming the best version of yourself. As spring arrived and the world renewed itself around him, Ethan began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on, it was about integration. His father's death had become part of his story, not the end of it. Each day he carried forward the love, values, and memories that had shaped him, while slowly building new experiences and relationships around them. The morning escort to school continued, but now Ethan looked forward to those rides as opportunities to hear more stories about his father, to feel connected to the larger family of law enforcement that had claimed him as their own. He was learning to carry his grief with dignity, just as his father had carried his badge, with honor, purpose, and unwavering commitment to those he loved. By his 9th birthday, Ethan had grown 3 inches and learned to navigate the complex geography of loss with increasing confidence. The sharp, breathless panic that once accompanied memories of his father had softened into something more manageable, a persistent ache that reminded him daily of love's profound weight. He understood now that missing someone wasn't weakness. It was proof of connection that transcended physical presence. The birthday itself presented a challenge neither he nor his mother had anticipated. Previous celebrations had been elaborate, affairs orchestrated by his father, treasure hunts through the house, elaborate themed parties, surprise trips to places that made Ethan's eyes shine with wonder. This year felt different, weighted with the significance of milestones his father would never witness. "I don't know how to do this without him," Sarah confessed to her sister the night before, her voice carrying the exhaustion of nearly a year, spent learning to be both mother and father. "David always made birthdays magical. I'm just trying to keep us both from falling apart." But Ethan had been listening from the hallway, and something in his mother's vulnerability sparked a realization. His father's magic hadn't come from elaborate gestures or expensive surprises. It had come from attention, presence, and the simple act of making ordinary moments feel special. At 9, Ethan was old enough to understand that legacy wasn't something you inherited passively. It was something you actively chose to carry forward. The morning of his birthday, he found his mother in the kitchen, staring at a boxed cake mix with the defeated expression of someone facing an impossible task. "Mom," he said gently, "Dad used to say the best birthday presents were the ones that came from the heart, not the store. Want to make pancakes instead?" He taught me his secret recipe. Together, they created chaos and joy in equal measure. Flour, dusting their clothes, and laughter filling spaces that had been too quiet for too long. As Ethan guided his mother through his father's technique for perfectly fluffy pancakes, he felt a profound shift, from receiver of his father's legacy to its active guardian and interpreter. At school, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, announced that Ethan had volunteered to share something special with the class for his birthday. Standing before his classmates, he pulled out a worn notebook filled with his father's handwriting, observations about community policing, ideas for helping neighborhood kids, dreams of making their town safer and more connected. "My dad wasn't just a police officer," Ethan began, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "He was someone who believed that taking care of each other was the most important job anyone could have. He wrote down all these ideas about how to make our community better, and I've been reading them." He shared his father's vision of police officers as community builders, not just law enforcers. He talked about his father's after-school program, ideas, his plans for neighborhood gardens, his dream of creating safe spaces where kids could go when home felt scary or lonely. With each story, Ethan saw his classmates' understanding deepen. His father transformed from abstract hero to tangible presence, who had actively worked to improve their shared world. Officer Martinez, who had become a regular visitor to Ethan's class, watched from the back of the room with tears in his eyes. After school, he approached Ethan with unusual seriousness. "Your father would be incredibly proud," he said, kneeling to Ethan's eye level. "But I want you to know something important. You don't have to carry all of his dreams alone. Some of us are working to make his community programs happen. Would you like to help?" The invitation opened new possibilities. Ethan began attending community meetings where adults discussed his father's proposals with reverence and determination. He discovered that his father's death had catalyzed changes that might have taken years to implement otherwise. The David Mitchell Community Center was already in planning stages, funded by donations from across the state. During these meetings, Ethan learned to speak up, to share insights about what kids his age actually needed and wanted. His voice carried unique authority because it connected his father's vision to the reality of children's daily experiences. Adults listened when he suggested that the community center should have quiet spaces for homework alongside active areas for sports, that it should welcome all kids regardless of their family situations. At home, Ethan started a journal of his own, documenting ideas for carrying forward his father's work. He wrote about kindness as a form of courage, about the importance of standing up for kids who felt different or left out, about how paying attention to people's needs was a superpower that anyone could develop. His mother found him one evening, writing intently by lamplight. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" "Dad's next chapter," Ethan replied without looking up. "He started something important, and I think I'm supposed to help write the rest of the story." Sarah felt her heart expand with pride and recognition. Her son was becoming a bridge between his father's unrealized dreams and a future full of possibility. David's legacy was not just being preserved, it was evolving, growing, taking on new dimensions through the love and determination of the child he had raised to believe in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. That night, as Ethan fell asleep clutching his journal, he dreamed of his father not as someone lost to the past, but as a presence guiding him toward a future where love could be translated into action, where grief could become fuel for building the kind of world worth protecting. 2 years had passed since that terrible afternoon when Ethan's world fractured along invisible lines, and now, at 10 years old, he stood before the newly dedicated David Mitchell Community Center, watching his father's dreams take concrete form. The building rose from what had once been an empty lot, its warm brick facade and welcoming windows designed to embrace rather than intimidate, to invite rather than exclude. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, police officers from Mao, neighboring counties, teachers and students from Ethan's school, families who had been touched by Officer Mitchell's service, and children who would benefit from programs they'd never known they needed. Ethan wore his best shirt and the tie his father had taught him to knot, feeling the weight of representation settle comfortably on his shoulders. Chief Williams approached the podium with the measured dignity of someone who had delivered many eulogies but had never stopped believing in the power of celebration to balance sorrow. David Mitchell was many things, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. He was a dedicated officer, a loving husband, a devoted father. But, perhaps most importantly, he was someone who saw potential where others saw problems, who saw community where others saw strangers. Ethan listened from the front row, his mother's hand warm in his as speakers shared stories he'd never heard. How his father had quietly paid for groceries for struggling families. How he'd organized pickup basketball games in troubled neighborhoods. How he'd spent his own money on school supplies for teachers who couldn't afford them. Each story added layers to his understanding of the man he'd known simply as Dad. When his turn came to speak, Ethan approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The crowd quieted, faces turning toward him with expressions of gentle expectation. My dad used to tell me that being a hero wasn't about doing one big thing that everyone remembers, Ethan began, his young voice clear and strong. He said it was about doing little things every day that might not seem important to you, but could change someone else's whole world. He talked about the morning escorts that had continued faithfully for 2 years, how Officer Martinez still arrived at their door every day with stories and encouragement. He spoke about the grief counseling sessions that had taught him to carry sadness without being crushed by it, about the martial arts classes that had shown him how to transform anger into discipline and purpose. This community center isn't just named after my father, Ethan continued, his eyes finding friendly faces throughout the crowd. It's going to do the work he would have done if he could still be here. And all of us, every kid who comes here to do homework or play sports or just have a safe place to be, we get to be part of continuing his story. The ribbon-cutting ceremony felt like a moment of profound completion and beginning simultaneously. As the red ribbon fell away and children rushed through the doors to explore their new space, Ethan felt his father's presence not as absence, but as continuation. Love made visible through community action, grief transformed into generative possibility. Inside the center, Ethan showed his friends the reading corner where his father's favorite children's books were displayed, the gymnasium where kids could play regardless of whether they could afford league fees, the quiet study rooms, designed for children who struggled to find peace at home. Each space reflected lessons his father had taught him about the importance of seeing and responding to others' needs. Officer Martinez found him in the memorial corner, where his father's badge was displayed alongside photos and commendations. You know, Martinez said quietly, your dad always worried about what kind of world he was leaving for you. I think he'd be amazed to see what kind of world you're building for other kids. That evening, as the celebration wound down and families headed home, Ethan walked through the empty community center with his mother and Officer Martinez. The building felt alive with possibility, pregnant with the laughter and learning and growth that would soon fill its halls. I still miss him every day, Ethan said simply, running his hand along the smooth wooden railing his father would never touch. But I don't feel sad about it anymore. I feel responsible. Like I get to be the person he was training me to be. Sarah wrapped her son in a fierce hug, marveling at the young man emerging from the boy she'd held through so many nights of tears. He's so proud of you, she whispered. We both are. As they locked up and headed home, Ethan looked back at the community center one final time. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The daily acts of welcome and care that would transform his father's dreams into lived reality. He thought about the children who would find safety within those walls, the families who would discover community, The ordinary moments that would bloom into extraordinary connections. The thin blue line that had once felt like protection had evolved into something larger, a network of care that extended far beyond law enforcement, encompassing teachers and counselors, neighbors and friends, children who had learned to see themselves as guardians of each other's well-being. His father's legacy lived not in memory alone, but in action, choice, and the infinite ways love could multiply when planted in fertile ground. Walking home under stars that seemed unusually bright, Ethan felt the deep satisfaction of someone who has learned to transform loss into gift, grief into service, and love into legacy that would outlast any single lifetime.